how should we govern ourselves? What's the right technology to govern people in countries, in companies? The Brits are now celebrating the Jubilee. Basically, they're celebrating their monarchy, and even people like Brad Hall are trying to make the point that the monarchy was successful. Recently, I listened to a guy who calls himself Austrian economist, very libertarian views of the world. He thinks monarchy is probably the best way to govern simply because the monarchy has an incentive to keep a country afloat and healthy because it's kind of a family-owned business. I want to talk about this because I completely disagree. I think monarchies are outdated. They're just plain wrong, and the reason they're wrong is that we can't just randomly select a family and then tell them that you guys run the show. And having things like constitutional monarchy or whatever is just, it's kind of like a hybrid electric car. You try to combine two things. What Brad is saying in his comments is that, well, we tried other things in Europe and it ended up in disaster, namely Hitler and Stalin and Lenin and all that. Yes, but at least we tried. And I mean, a true Popperian would not be against trial and error. And yeah, the cost of error correction in this case in Germany and Russia, very, very high. Russia still paying a huge price for getting rid of the Tsar because they just have a new Tsar, which is as bad, if not worse, than the old one. So yeah, there's a lot of things to be discussed. But overall, I think that we need to have a much, much faster iteration in terms of who runs the show. And we need to find a way to do that. And I want to try to find at least or let me just gather my thoughts. This is, like many of my podcasts, this is not scripted. There's not a lot of notes here. This is certainly researched, and I thought about it, but I try to see where I get with this while I'm recording it. And the question in this particular episode is, what's the best way to govern a bunch of people? And it applies also to companies. That's why it's relevant. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. We run Orange Capital Partners. We're a business, and we think a lot about governance. So that's why this is very relevant. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's June 6, 2022. This is Krim Delco. It's a Monday morning here in Europe, so the markets in the US are still closed. Thereof, we're still, as of last Friday, we're down 43.6%. The market's down 13.2%. We're underperforming by 30.4%. The markets are still closed, as I said, because, again, Europe, US, time difference, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about first, congratulations to the Queen of England, Elizabeth, and happy Jubilee for all the Brits. I don't have any grudge against this. I have never been hurt by the monarchy or by anybody who is a monarch lover or anything like that. So I don't have any issues with that from a political perspective. This is me just trying to be as objective as I can, discussing how should we govern ourselves. So let's start with governments, countries, and then we go, I'll try to, arch into companies and families, for that matter. I mean, anywhere where there's a bunch of people together, there's a need for government. So let's talk about the monarchies. What is the monarchy? Look, we have a bunch of people living together and deciding that they should have something called feudalism. This is post-Roman Empire Europe, okay? This is what I know. There's other cultures, India, China, they had different structures. I know this one, and this is the one that probably is most relevant in a sense that, without hurting anybody's feelings, I think the most iteration has happened in Europe. So we've had more tries and errors than probably anywhere else. And therefore, it's more interesting to talk about this in this context. I'm not saying this is better than elsewhere or anything like that. It's just more interesting to talk about because there's been more iteration. So we have this monarchy, and it's a family that owns the right to give other people land. And as a compensation for that, these other people, the feudalists, the dukes and lords and all that, they protect the land and the king. So everybody fights for the king, and the king becomes synonymous with what we will call country today. Of course, there was no country back then in the Middle Ages or whenever this whole thing started. Actually, there's a good show on Netflix, The Last Kingdom, which kind of probably shows in a Hollywood way, of course, how this whole thing started. You know, you had the Vikings, the raids, constantly attacking villages, and then there was a need to unite. And what happened is there was this person, I think his name was Arthur, King Arthur. He united everybody and fighting against the Vikings. And it was back and forth, and they lost battles, won battles. There was Christianity involved also, which kind of tied everything together. And it's probably a good, at least, analogy to what actually happened in those days around Europe. And similarly, of course, the same thing must have happened in France and so on and so forth. So we have this situation, and it works because it wins. Okay, so this is the key. And before I go further, the reason I disagree with the point that, let's say, constitutional monarchy has been very successful. Look at what Britain and the UK and the Commonwealth have achieved. Well, yeah, I mean, you guys achieved a lot of things, but we don't know what else could have happened if you guys didn't rule the world. I mean, you guys being the Brits, if you didn't rule the world for a couple hundred years, because you had the strongest navy and because you got scale, and at that scale you were invincible, well, maybe other things could have happened. I mean, this is the same argument like saying, well, you know, Microsoft software is really the best software because look how far it's gotten us. Yeah, but we never know what would have happened if Microsoft did not become a monopoly, and if other innovations could have happened faster, more iteration could have happened than we have today in software. Not that we don't have enough iteration, but we could have had a lot more iteration back in the 80s when it really matters. So the point here is just we want to protect the concept of iteration itself and not just accept a solution because it's the best solution. That the same way with things like free markets, Adam Smith, invisible hand, capitalism. All of these things are open for debate. And we should not be celebrating jubilees of capitalism or jubilees of you know, Microsoft running the software world, or I don't know, GE being the best company for airplane engines. That would be stupid. It's parochial. I mean, I'm sorry. Let's say there's a lot of things that used to be and now they're not anymore, and that's really what matters. People used to rape everybody, and proliferate their own tribe relative to another one. Well, they could have jubilees about that, and I'm sure they did. The thing is, we actually iterated, we changed. And I think what we should be jubileeing is change and not something that's been around for thousands of years. This is my point here. And then you run the risk that power is being abused. This is the fundamental problem of any government. And the argument for monarchy is because it's a family-owned business, the family has an incentive to keep it sane, to keep it afloat, to not waste its trust with the people. Like a family, you want to run it in a way that it sustains over generations. This is the argument. And I say, yes, there's definitely a lot of truth there. There's nothing wrong with that argument as far as that's concerned. What are the drawbacks? Well, we have an arbitrary government chosen, or an arbitrary family chosen to be running the show, and that's not acceptable. I don't care. It's not okay. I'm not a big fan of this arbitrary thing. On the other hand, also, by the way, it's not arbitrary. I'm reading Morgan Hall right now. There's a lot of intrigue, a lot of killing, a lot of deaths. Maybe now it's not happening anymore, but back in the day, when the monarchies, whenever it was decided, well, who is the monarch and who isn't, there was a lot of kids died because, you know, I want this hair, I don't want that hair, I want a boy, I don't want a girl, all that stuff. We're a bit past that now, but even now, you know, Lady Diana, if she died in an accident, we're not so sure. So there's a lot of intrigue on that front, and that's, maybe you can say, well, it's better that a few people died and all countries killed each other and so on and so forth. Again, I'll take that. But my point here is that I'm against this argument that, well, we've run it as a family business, because what's the drawback? Okay, the drawback is, one is scalability. Like, you can't scale up a family business. The reason we have public companies, the reason we have joint stock companies, why isn't everything private? Well, because we need to scale up. We need professional management We need that. It's not always ideal. And this leads me actually already to a point that I want to make, which is, look, I'm not against hybrids. Actually, I believe in companies. There is something analogous to a monarchy, which is the founder. And they are important. They give you the North Star, the company, the culture. The purpose of the company is defined by the founder, not by the managers. You know, Drew Balino is a fantastic person when it comes to making batteries, but he is not the North Star of Tesla. It's Elon Musk. Bezos is the North Star of Amazon. Zuckerberg is the North Star of Facebook. And sometimes that doesn't go well, like in the case of Facebook. Maybe shareholders of Facebook would love to have somebody else to be the North Star, but it is Zuckerberg because he's the founder. And the point here is that I'm not against these hybrids. What I'm against is I need more iteration. I don't want to see one person for 70 years being the head of state. End of story. And we have a success story, which is the United States. George Washington could have been that founding father. And the George Washington family could have been the family, like the mafia that runs the United States. But he chose not to. And therefore, George Washington is the greatest leader in the history of the world. Because at least to my knowledge, he's the only one who had the option. There's another person which was one of the greatest leaders, probably the greatest leader next to George Washington, that's Henry Truman. Because he was the only person in the world who actually had the weapons to terrorize the whole world. Because the United States, for a brief period of time, was the only power that had nuclear power. Now, I don't know the details, and I would love to read more about this, but the way I read it and heard it is simply that he chose not to. Maybe he couldn't, whatever. He chose not to. So again, the greatest leaders are those that we rarely talk about because they're not in everybody's face. They're not always, the picture is there. So in that sense, even George Washington is greater than somebody like Elon Musk. And I wish Musk was more like George Washington. But anyway, that's a different story. My point here is that the greatest leaders are those that create a system that can sustain itself after they leave. So I guess my point of this particular episode is what I like to see is a George Washington style way of governance, where you have a constitutional government with a very strong leader, a founder, and he builds structures and hires people, Alexander Hamilton and so on and so forth, that can actually implement the idea of a strong government that can sustain the values of this particular organization. I think this is the key. So I would say George Washington is my go-to model when it comes to governance. And you know, there's one thing I would like to say to these people that think monarchy is the place to be. When I was a teenager, for some reason, growing up in Switzerland, I wasn't dying to go live in a monarchy. It wasn't my goal. But I was dying to go live in the United States. The United States was my go-to place, and I actually ended up there. It took me a bit longer, had to get some education, make some money, get accepted to fancy business schools and all that. It just, that was my way. Other people choose other ways. But I'm not the only one, obviously, whose dream it is to come to the United States. And there's a reason why. And I think it's directly related to what George Washington has created. And I think that's the goal. So I think, and that's what Silicon Valley is, I think, mirroring. Silicon Valley is creating a system of founders that hopefully can sustain themselves. And I've spoken, let's say, with Howard Schultz about this. Not that we're friendly, but it was a conference, and he spoke about this. So I was part of that particular table where he was on, and he spoke about how can I create a company that can sustain itself. And you know, quite frankly, he wasn't able to, because he keeps coming back trying to save Starbucks. It's his second time now that he's coming back because he's just not able to hire professional managers. And I think it's his shortcoming. He's a good operator. He's not a George Washington. It's his shortcoming. You know, with all the good things that he's done, that's the one thing he wasn't able to do. I don't know if Elon Musk is able to do it. Hopefully he can still stay CEO for Tesla and SpaceX for a long time so we don't have to test it. But at some point, these people have to start thinking very hard about how to replace themselves. And that's what George Washington did, because it was part of the Constitution. People like Jefferson and all these other people that wrote the Constitution made sure that whoever comes in is not going to stay there for a long time. And Washington could have stayed, but he didn't want to. And that's, again, to me, that's the model. That's what I'm trying to, if I'm asked how should we govern ourselves, what are the companies that I want to invest in? I want to invest in those types of companies that have strong cultural, inspiring leaders that build a value system that can sustain itself. And therefore, that's the right way. It's not the monarchy. It's not somebody who happens to be the founder and then they just run it and then their kids run it. That's not a good idea. And all the other ideas that we had, this, representative democracy in Europe, not a good idea. I agree with Brad Hall on that one. It just ends up in disaster all the time. Europe's a train wreck waiting to hit something. Because partly of that, there's other reasons, but it's not a good idea. So we need a hybrid system, but it has to be iterative. Iterative in a sense that the people who are in power, the founders, the people, the George Washingtons of this world, create a system that can replace itself and keep iterating also. That's the key, keep iterating in terms of leaders. Thank you.